The execution chamber was silent, save for the dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Samuel Blake sat in his cell, staring at the cold, gray walls that had become his world for the past year. His hands were steady, but his eyes carried a storm, an unrelenting mix of pain, regret, and the faintest flicker of defiance. Outside the prison, reporters gathered in droves, eager to chronicle the death of a man branded as a monster. The headlines had already sealed his fate: crime lord meets justice, betrayer to the bitter end. To the world, Samuel Blake was a villain, and his death was nothing more than a satisfying punctuation to his infamous story. But within the suffocating confines of his cell, another story brewed. A story few knew, but one that would shake everyone who heard it. Samuel's mind drifted to the beginning of his descent. A life that once held promise had become a string of betrayals and shattered dreams. His heart clenched as he thought of Clara, the woman who had once been his everything. Her laughter used to light up the darkest corners of his soul, but now, her name was a bitter taste on his tongue. The betrayal had been slow and insidious. At first, it was the small things: missed dinners, distant glances, a growing chasm where their connection once thrived. But then came the lies, and Samuel could still remember the night he discovered her affair. It had been a rainy evening. The city streets were slick with water, and Samuel had rushed home early from work, eager to surprise Clara with a simple bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked up from a street vendor. He'd never been the romantic type, but something inside him had stirred that day, a longing to reconnect, to remind her of the love they'd shared. When he opened the door to their modest apartment, the sound of muffled voices froze him in his tracks. Clara's laughter, once his favorite melody, now sounded foreign, sharp, and wrong. He crept closer, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anger. There she was, draped across the couch, her hand resting intimately on another man's thigh. It was Eric, his best friend, the man he'd trusted above all others. The wildflowers fell from Samuel's hand, their delicate petals scattering across the floor. Samuel. Clara jumped to her feet, her face a mask of shock and guilt. Eric remained seated, his expression a twisted blend of arrogance and false apology. This isn't what it looks like," Clara stammered, but the lie was weak, and they all knew it. Samuel didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply turned and walked out, the sound of the rain swallowing the chaos erupting behind him. But inside, something broke, a piece of him he would never get back. The weeks that followed were a blur of confusion and pain. Samuel tried to salvage his marriage, clinging to the hope that Clara might still love him. He forgave her once, then twice, and even a third time, each betrayal cutting deeper than the last. But it wasn't just the infidelity that hurt. It was the cruelty, the coldness in her eyes when she looked at him. "You're not enough," she said one night during an argument that ended with her packing her bags. "You never were." Her words echoed in Samuel's mind like a curse, poisoning every memory of the life they'd built together. And when she left, she didn't go alone. She took their son, Jacob, a bright-eyed boy who had been Samuel's anchor through the darkest times. The abandonment was complete. Samuel found himself alone, drowning in a sea of debts Clara had left behind. She and Eric had emptied their joint accounts, leaving him with nothing but a pile of bills and the mocking silence of an empty home. Humiliation followed him like a shadow. Friends he thought he could rely on distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the man whose wife had publicly ridiculed him. At work, whispers filled the halls, and Samuel was eventually forced to resign after Clara spread lies about him being abusive, a narrative Eric happily corroborated. It wasn't long before Samuel hit rock bottom. With no job, no family, and no support, he wandered the streets, seeking solace at the bottom of a bottle. Nights blurred into mornings, each day a reminder of how far he'd fallen. But fate wasn't finished with him yet. One fateful night, as Samuel stumbled through a desolate alley, he found himself cornered by two men demanding money he didn't have. They beat him senseless, leaving him bruised and broken on the cold, wet pavement. As he lay there, staring at the starless sky, something inside him snapped. Anger surged through his veins, mingling with the despair that had consumed him for months. He swore in that moment to never be a victim again. Samuel clawed his way back to his feet, but the man who emerged from that alley was not the same. He was harder, colder, a shadow of his former self. With nothing left to lose, he turned to a life he once despised: crime. It started small, selling stolen goods, running errands for dangerous men. But Samuel quickly proved himself to be shrewd and resourceful, rising through the ranks of a powerful syndicate. Yet, even as he gained wealth and power, the emptiness inside him remained. No amount of money could fill the void left by Clara and Jacob. And then came the ultimate betrayal. Years later, as Samuel's criminal empire grew, he discovered that Clara and Eric were not just thriving, they had partnered with his enemies to ensure his downfall. Every move he made, every risk he took, they were there, lurking in the shadows, feeding information to those who sought to destroy him. It was Clara who orchestrated his arrest. She had manipulated the authorities, painting Samuel as the mastermind behind crimes he didn't commit. When he was finally taken into custody, she stood in the courtroom, her face a mask of triumph as she testified against him. "I trusted you," Samuel had said, his voice breaking as he looked at the woman he once loved. "I gave you everything, and it wasn't enough," Clara replied coldly. Now, as Samuel sat in his cell, awaiting his execution, he felt the weight of every betrayal, every rejection, every humiliation. The world thought they knew his story, but they didn't. They didn't know about the love that had been twisted into hatred. They didn't know about the sacrifices he'd made or the pain he'd endured. And they certainly didn't know about the truth he was about to reveal, truths that would shatter the carefully constructed lies of those who had destroyed him. As the clock ticked closer to his final moments, Samuel smiled faintly. His execution would not be the end of his story. It would be the beginning of theirs, their reckoning, their downfall. "They think I'm the villain," he whispered to himself. "But they haven't seen the whole picture. Not yet." The sound of footsteps echoed down the dimly lit corridor outside Samuel's cell. They were deliberate, unhurried, the kind that carried authority and finality. He knew what they meant. Time was running out. Still, he sat motionless on the edge of the cot, his gaze fixed on the small, barred window that allowed a sliver of moonlight to creep in. His mind was alive with memories, each one sharper than the last, cutting into him like shards of glass. It wasn't the execution he feared. Death was a mere formality at this point, a conclusion he had accepted long ago. What haunted him was the possibility of leaving this world without the truth being known. That thought burned deeper than any pain the lethal injection could bring. The truth was his only weapon now, and he intended to wield it with precision, to deliver a blow so devastating that those who had betrayed him would feel its sting long after he was gone. As the guard stopped outside his cell, keys jangling, Samuel tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the man's presence without turning fully toward him. The door creaked open, and a low, gravelly voice broke the silence. 15 minutes, Blake. Then it's showtime." Samuel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The guard lingered for a moment, as if expecting something, perhaps a plea, a sign of fear, or even a confession. But Samuel gave him nothing, and after a brief pause, the man retreated, the heavy clang of the cell door closing reverberating through the cold, sterile air. Alone again, Samuel leaned back against the wall, the tension in his chest building. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to ensure that everything was in place, that the final act of his life would unfold exactly as he had planned. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about Clara, about Eric, about Jacob. And it was about a betrayal so profound that it had left scars not only on his soul but on the lives of countless others. His thoughts drifted to Jacob. The boy had been the one pure thing in Samuel's life, a beacon of light in an otherwise dark existence. He remembered the nights he would sit by Jacob's bedside, reading stories until the boy's eyelids grew heavy with sleep. He remembered the way Jacob's small hand would reach out to grab his, holding on with a trust so absolute it had brought tears to Samuel's eyes. "Promise me, Dad," Jacob had said once, his voice soft and earnest. "You'll always be there for me." "I promise, kiddo," Samuel had replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "Always?" But that promise had been broken the day Clara took Jacob away. She had ripped him out of Samuel's arms, using lies and manipulation to paint Samuel as an unfit father. The courts had believed her. Everyone had believed her. And Samuel had been powerless to stop it. The memory of their last meeting played in his mind like a cruel film on repeat. Jacob had been 8 years old, his eyes wide with confusion as Samuel knelt before him, holding back tears. "I'll come back for you," Samuel had whispered, his voice trembling. "I swear it." Jacob had nodded, but the sadness in his eyes was too heavy for a child to bear. Clara had stood nearby, her arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips as she watched the scene unfold. She hadn't even tried to hide her satisfaction, her victory. "Time's up," she'd said coldly, grabbing Jacob's hand and pulling him away. Samuel's heart had shattered that day, but the pain only deepened when he learned what Clara had been doing behind the scenes. She wasn't just erasing him from Jacob's life, she was poisoning his son against him. By the time Jacob turned 16, he refused to answer Samuel's letters, each one returned unopened, a painful reminder of how completely Clara had succeeded in cutting Samuel out. But Samuel had never stopped trying. Even as his life spiraled out of control, even as the walls closed in around him, he clung to the hope that one day Jacob would learn the truth. That one day, his son would see that Samuel wasn't the villain Clara had made him out to be. And now, here he was, on the brink of death, with one final chance to set the record straight. A sudden knock on the cell door pulled him from his thoughts. This time, it wasn't the guard. It was a visitor, someone Samuel hadn't seen in years, but had been expecting. The door opened, and there she was, Clara. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She looked different, older, though the years hadn't dulled the sharpness in her eyes or the cold set of her jaw. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her appearance a calculated display of control and power. "Samuel," she said, her voice as smooth as silk but laced with condescension. "I thought I'd come to say goodbye. For closure." He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Closure? Is that what you call this?" Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You brought this on yourself, you know. All of it. If you'd just stayed in your lane, played your role, things could have been different." Samuel's jaw tightened. "My role? Is that what you told yourself every time you twisted the knife? Every time you lied to Jacob about me?" Her expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "I did what I had to do to protect him. To protect myself." "Protect?" Samuel's voice rose, his anger finally bubbling to the surface. "You didn't protect him, Clara. You used him. You used him to hurt me. And you didn't care what it did to him in the process." She opened her mouth to respond, but Samuel cut her off, standing now, his imposing figure towering over her. "But it's over now," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you're going to regret every choice you made. Because when that clock hits 0, everyone's going to know the truth." Clara's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "What are you talking about?" Samuel leaned in, his lips curling into a faint, almost menacing smile. "You'll see." Her composure wavered, and for the first time, Samuel saw a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed. She turned on her heel and left without another word, the sound of the cell door slamming shut echoing in the air. Samuel sat back down, his heart pounding. The stage was set, the pieces in place. All that remained was the final act. The air in the cell grew heavier as Samuel sat in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity, each tick of the unseen clock a reminder of the inevitable. But there was no fear in him now, only a simmering determination. Clara's visit had solidified it. She was shaken, and for the first time in years, he had seen doubt in her eyes. It was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He clenched his fists, the memories of her manipulation clawing at his mind. Clara had built her life on lies, climbing a ladder made of deceit and broken promises. She had painted herself as the perfect mother, the victim, the martyr. But Samuel knew better. He had seen the darkness behind her mask, the lengths she would go to maintain control. And he knew that if he didn't act now, her legacy of destruction would continue. The sound of voices drifted in from the corridor, muffled and indistinct, but Samuel could sense the tension in them. Something was happening, something beyond the walls of his cell. He closed his eyes, letting his thoughts drift to Jacob. The boy would be a man now, old enough to make his own choices, to seek his own truth. Samuel wondered if Jacob had ever doubted the stories Clara told him. Had he ever questioned why his father disappeared, why every attempt at contact was severed before it could reach him? Or had he accepted Clara's narrative as gospel, turning his back on Samuel forever? A lump formed in Samuel's throat at the thought. He had always envisioned a reunion with Jacob, a moment of reckoning where father and son would face each other, unburdened by Clara's lies. But as the minutes ticked by, the possibility of that moment faded. If Jacob wasn't here now, he likely never would be. The door to the corridor creaked open, and heavy footsteps approached once more. This time it was the warden. A tall, stoic man with a weathered face. He stepped into the cell, his gaze steady but not unkind. "It's time," he said simply. Samuel stood, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no point in resisting. He had prepared for this, rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. As the warden motioned for him to follow, Samuel caught a glimpse of something in the man's expression, a flicker of hesitation, maybe even pity. But Samuel didn't need pity. He needed resolve. The walk to the execution chamber was eerily quiet, the sound of their footsteps the only accompaniment. The hallways were stark, their gray walls devoid of any warmth or humanity. As they turned a corner, Samuel saw a small group of people gathered behind a glass partition. Witnesses. He recognized a few faces, reporters, guards, and, to his surprise, Clara. She stood near the back, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Samuel's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that instant, he saw the cracks in her facade. She wasn't here out of duty or curiosity. She was here because she was afraid. Afraid of what he might say. Afraid of the truth he might reveal. They reached the chamber, and Samuel was led to a chair in the center of the room. Straps were fastened around his wrists and ankles, the leather biting into his skin. The room was cold, sterile, devoid of any hint of compassion. Samuel's eyes flicked to the microphone placed on the table before him. His heart raced. This was it, his final chance to speak, to make his voice heard. The warden stepped forward, clearing his throat. "You have 2 minutes for any final words." Samuel inhaled deeply, his mind racing. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it threatened to overwhelm him. He looked through the glass partition, his gaze locking onto Clara. Then he began to speak. "My life," he started, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "has been defined by betrayal, by lies, and by the pain of losing the people I loved most in this world. I stand here today, not as a guilty man, but as a man who has been wronged in ways most of you will never understand." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. The witnesses were silent, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "I was a father," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "A father who loved his son more than anything. But that love was stolen from me. Twisted. Used as a weapon to destroy me. Clara," he said, his gaze boring into her, "you took everything from me. You turned Jacob against me. You told him I was a monster, that I didn't care about him. And he believed you. He believed you because you poisoned his mind, just like you poisoned mine." Clara's expression remained stoic, but Samuel could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands clenched at her sides. "But the truth," Samuel said, his voice now a steady crescendo, "has a way of coming to light. And tonight, that truth will be revealed." The room was deathly silent, every eye fixed on Samuel. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing them to hang, on every word. "Clara," he said, "you thought you had won. You thought you had silenced me. But you forgot one thing: secrets have a way of unraveling. And when they do, they leave destruction in their wake." He sat back, a faint smile playing on his lips as the warden stepped forward, signaling the end of his speech. Samuel met Clara's eyes one last time, his expression calm, almost serene. She shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking under the weight of his words. As the warden gave the final order, Samuel closed his eyes, his heart steady. The truth was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before it found its way to the light. The silence in the chamber was suffocating as Samuel's final words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Clara's face, once a mask of composure, began to falter. She had spent years building her version of the truth, carefully crafting a narrative that kept her sins buried. Yet now, with Samuel's cryptic declaration, the foundation she had so meticulously constructed began to crack. The warden hesitated, his hand hovering over the signal button. The air seemed charged with tension, every breath in the room held, as if the universe itself waited for what would come next. Behind the glass partition, Clara shifted her weight, her usually sharp gaze darting nervously between Samuel and the onlookers. The other witnesses remained still, their eyes wide, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. Samuel opened his eyes slowly, a smirk playing on his lips, as if he could feel the chaos his words had ignited. He wasn't finished, and he knew it. His voice, though steady, carried an edge that cut through the silence. "Clara," he said again, deliberately, drawing every syllable out. "Do you think they'll believe you when the truth comes out? Do you think Jacob will look at you the same way when he learns what you've done?" Clara's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of her chair. A bead of sweat trailed down her temple, unnoticed but telling. For years, she had operated with the confidence of someone who believed themselves untouchable. Now, Samuel's words were dragging her into the light she had avoided at all costs. Samuel's gaze swept over the other witnesses, making eye contact with each of them as if daring them to question his sanity. "You all think you're here to see justice," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "But you've only seen one side of the story. The side she wanted you to see. The lies she's been feeding you. And you, Clara," he turned back to her, his expression darkening. "You've been running for so long, but the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it?" Clara's breathing quickened, her mind racing. She had always been able to manipulate situations to her advantage, always one step ahead. But Samuel was unraveling her carefully maintained image with every word. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: fear. The warden cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Mr. Carter, your time for final words has ended," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. It was clear he, too, was caught in the web of Samuel's revelation. Samuel leaned back in the chair, a faint, almost triumphant smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I've said enough for now," he replied, his tone calm but dripping with intent. "But don't worry, Clara. The truth doesn't die with me. It never does." The warden gave a reluctant nod, signaling to the guards to prepare for the next steps. The room shifted as people began to stir, their unease palpable. Behind the glass, Clara's hands trembled ever so slightly. Her carefully crafted world was beginning to implode, and she could feel the weight of every lie, every betrayal, pressing down on her. But Samuel wasn't done. As the guards moved to secure him, he turned his head slightly, his voice low but audible enough to reach Clara. "You think this ends here? This is just the beginning." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time, she couldn't predict what would happen next. Samuel's cryptic threats had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of everyone in the room, and she could already feel the whispers beginning. As the guards began to adjust the straps, one of them hesitated, glancing at the warden. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a collective uncertainty about whether they were truly about to execute a guilty man or an innocent one. Clara stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. The sound drew every eye in the room, and she suddenly found herself the center of attention. Her carefully rehearsed mask of control slipped further, and for a moment, she looked as vulnerable as the lies she had told. I need some air, she stammered, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. Without waiting for permission, she turned and walked briskly out of the observation room, her heels clicking against the cold, sterile floor. Samuel watched her go, a deep satisfaction settling over him. He had waited years for this moment, endured pain, isolation, and betrayal, all for the chance to expose Clara for who she truly was. And now, the first domino had fallen. But Samuel knew this wasn't the end. Clara's reaction was only the beginning of the unraveling. He had planted the seeds of doubt, and now he needed to trust that they would grow. Somewhere out there, Jacob was watching. Somewhere, the truth was already starting to surface. The warden's voice broke through his thoughts, calm but firm. "Let's proceed." Samuel nodded, a strange peace washing over him. He had played his part, and now, the rest was up to fate. The weight of his words lingered in the room, a silent promise of the reckoning yet to come. As doors slammed shut behind Clara, her heels echoed like a metronome against the sterile corridor walls. The weight of Samuel's words pressed down on her chest, suffocating and relentless. Her carefully constructed facade, years in the making, felt as fragile as a house of cards. Each step forward felt heavier, as though the hallway itself resisted her escape. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her mind racing through the implications of what had just transpired. She reached the end of the corridor and shoved open the door to the observation balcony. The crisp evening air hit her face like a slap, and for a brief moment, she thought she might collapse. But she couldn't. Not here. Not now. Clara gripped the railing, the cool metal biting into her palms as she tried to steady herself. She stared out into the dark horizon, the city lights below flickering like stars mocking her from a safe distance. Samuel's voice echoed in her mind, each word like a knife carving through the carefully curated image she had fought so hard to maintain. His accusations, vague as they were, carried a truth that she couldn't entirely deny. And now, the witnesses who had once looked to her as a grieving victim might start asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer. From behind her, the sound of footsteps approached. Clara stiffened, but didn't turn around. Her instinct for control told her to maintain composure, even if her world felt as though it were crumbling beneath her. "Clara." Jacob's voice was calm, but there was an edge of uncertainty she hadn't heard before. She turned slowly, schooling her features into something resembling calm. Jacob's face was unreadable, his dark eyes searching hers for something she wasn't sure she could fake anymore. "You left so suddenly," he said, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" Clara forced a thin smile, one she hoped looked convincing. "I just needed a moment. This whole thing, it's a lot." Jacob nodded, but his gaze lingered on her, suspicion flickering just beneath the surface. He wasn't convinced. She could see it in the way his brow furrowed, the way his hands fidgeted slightly at his sides. Jacob had always been perceptive, and now she realized just how dangerous that trait could be. "He said some strange things in there," Jacob continued cautiously. "About you. About the truth. What did he mean?" Clara's stomach twisted, but she held her ground. "He's desperate, Jacob," she replied, her voice steady, but her heart pounding in her chest. "He's trying to make me look bad, to shift the focus off himself. You can't seriously be considering—" "I'm not considering anything," Jacob interrupted, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But he sounded certain, like he knows something we don't. And you looked," he paused, searching for the right word. "You looked rattled." Clara's jaw tightened, her defenses snapping into place. "Of course I'm rattled, Jacob. The man who ruined my life is about to be executed, and instead of justice, all I'm getting are his cryptic accusations. Wouldn't you be rattled?" Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Clara thought he might push further. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe you're right," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. It's just, this whole thing feels off. Clara didn't respond immediately. She couldn't afford to. Every word she spoke was a delicate balance between maintaining her innocence and deflecting suspicion. If she pushed too hard, she might seem defensive. Too soft, and she risked giving him room to doubt her further. Samuel is a manipulator, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. He knows how to get under people's skin. Don't let him get under yours, Jacob. Please. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. You're right, he said, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. It's fine, Clara replied, forcing another smile. This will all be over soon. Jacob nodded again, but as he turned to leave, Clara felt a pang of unease. She watched him disappear down the corridor, her mind racing with contingency plans. Jacob's doubt was a problem, one she couldn't afford to ignore. If he started digging, if he began asking the wrong questions, it could all come crashing down. Back in the execution chamber, Samuel sat quietly, his expression calm, but his eyes alight with a quiet triumph. He could sense the ripple effect of his words, the way they had sown doubt and unease among those who once stood firmly against him. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep him going. The warden glanced at the clock, his brow furrowing. The delay was growing noticeable, and the witnesses were growing restless. Let's proceed, he said again, his voice firmer this time. The guards began to move, but Samuel raised his hand slightly, drawing their attention. A moment, please, he said, his tone polite but commanding. I have one last request. The warden hesitated, then nodded. What is it? Samuel leaned forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. A pen and paper, he said. Just for a moment. I promise it won't take long. The request was unusual, but the warden allowed it. A guard retrieved a notepad and pen, placing them on the table before Samuel. He picked up the pen with deliberate slowness, his movements calculated to draw out the moment. As the room watched in tense silence, Samuel began to write, the scratch of the pen against the paper the only sound. Clara's name appeared first, bold and unmistakable. He wrote deliberately, his handwriting sharp and angular, each stroke imbued with purpose. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and handed it back to the guard. Give this to her, he said simply, nodding toward the door Clara had exited through. The warden hesitated but nodded, motioning for the guard to comply. The note was delivered to Clara moments later, and as she unfolded it, her hands trembled. The words were simple but devastating. You can't run forever. They'll know. They'll all know. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, Clara felt the full weight of the walls closing in around her. Clara's grip on the note tightened, as though it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. Her eyes scanned the words over and over, hoping, desperately praying, that she had misunderstood their meaning. But the sharp clarity of Samuel's handwriting left no room for misinterpretation. It was a threat, veiled in just enough ambiguity to keep her on edge, yet pointed enough to shatter her composure. Her legs trembled beneath her, and for a moment, she thought they might give out entirely. She forced herself to move, retreating further onto the balcony where the cool night air wrapped around her like an accusation. The city below seemed so distant, its flickering lights mocking her from a place of safety she could no longer claim. Each breath felt harder to draw, each thought more chaotic than the last. Samuel's words echoed in her mind, intertwining with Jacob's earlier doubts. The world she had so meticulously constructed was beginning to crack, and she didn't know how to stop it. She had always prided herself on being one step ahead, on controlling the narrative. But now, it felt like the narrative was slipping from her grasp, spiraling into something she could no longer predict. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her out of her spiraling thoughts. She pulled it out with shaky hands, half expecting it to be another ominous message, but it was just a text from Jacob. Are you okay? Call me if you need to talk. She stared at the words, her heart pounding in her chest. Jacob's concern felt genuine, but it was tinged with the doubt she had seen in his eyes earlier. Could she trust him to stay loyal? Or would he be the next thread to unravel in this tangled mess? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She couldn't afford to lose Jacob, not now, not ever. Her fingers hovered over the screen, torn between calling him and deleting the message entirely. Before she could decide, another buzz interrupted her. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding as she saw the number. It was unknown, untraceable, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. She didn't want to answer, but the weight of curiosity and dread overpowered her hesitation. She pressed the green button, raising the phone to her ear with a trembling hand. "Hello." Her voice was barely above a whisper. There was silence on the other end, a heavy stillness that made her stomach churn. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice spoke, a voice she hadn't heard in years, but one she recognized instantly. "Clara." The way Samuel said her name was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an undercurrent of menace that made her blood run cold. "Did you get my message?" Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to respond. How are you calling me?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "You're supposed to be locked away." Samuel interrupted smoothly. "Yes, I am. But that doesn't mean I can't reach you, Clara. Surely you knew that." Her free hand gripped the balcony railing, the cold metal biting into her palm. "What do you want from me?" she asked, hating the way her voice quivered. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low chuckle. "Oh, Clara," he said, his tone almost pitying. "What I want isn't important. It's what you want that matters. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're running out of time." Her breath hitched, panic clawing at her chest. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Samuel replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The truth has a funny way of coming out, doesn't it? No matter how deeply you try to bury it, it always finds a way to the surface. And when it does, well, let's just say you might not like what people have to say." Clara's grip tightened on the phone, her knuckles turning white. "You're bluffing," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "You have no proof. No one will believe you." Samuel laughed again, the sound low and sinister. "Are you sure about that?" he asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like people are already starting to ask questions." "Isn't that right, Jacobs?" Clara's stomach dropped. The mention of Jacob's name felt like a dagger to her chest, sharp and unforgiving. How did Samuel know about Jacob's doubts? Had someone been feeding him information? Or was he just that good at reading people? "You don't know anything," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're just trying to scare me." "Am I?" Samuel's tone was calm, almost amused. "Tell me, Clara, how does it feel to be on the other side of the glass? To be the one who's scared, who's doubting, who's unraveling? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're finally getting a taste of your own medicine." Clara's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to yell, to hurl the phone over the edge of the balcony and let it shatter against the pavement below. But she couldn't. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he was getting to her. "You're going to rot in there," she said through gritted teeth. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends here." Samuel was silent for a moment, and for a brief second, Clara thought she might have regained the upper hand. But then he spoke again, his voice lower and more menacing than before. "Oh, Clara," he said softly. "The game is just beginning." The line went dead, leaving Clara standing on the balcony, her heart racing and her mind spiraling. She stared at the phone in her hand, the weight of Samuel's words pressing down on her like a physical force. She didn't know how he had managed to call her, but one thing was clear. He wasn't done with her yet. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure she could stop him. The night seemed colder now, more oppressive, as if the air itself had turned against Clara. She stood frozen on the balcony, her hand trembling as it gripped the phone. The city lights below, once distant and indifferent, now felt like prying eyes. Every shadow seemed to stretch further, every noise amplified in the silence that followed Samuel's voice. The words replayed in her mind, a relentless echo. "The game is just beginning." What did he mean? How was he doing this? Her thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. Samuel was locked away, miles from here, behind bars that should have kept him contained. And yet, he was here, in her mind, her life, her very skin. The note, the call, the chilling way he seemed to know every crack forming in her carefully built facade. It was more than she could bear. She rushed back inside, slamming the balcony door shut behind her. The glass rattled in its frame, the sound reverberating through the apartment like a gunshot. She dropped the phone onto the couch and paced the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to hold her unraveling nerves together. On the coffee table lay the letter Samuel had sent her a week earlier, its edges curling from where she had crumpled and smoothed it out repeatedly. She didn't want to read it again, but her eyes kept darting toward it, the temptation too strong. Each word was etched into her memory, but the weight of seeing them on the page was somehow heavier. She grabbed the letter and unfolded it with trembling hands. Her eyes skimmed the familiar handwriting, neat and deliberate, as though every stroke of the pen was calculated to inflict maximum damage. You think you're free, Clara, but you've always been bound by your own lies. And soon, everyone else will see them too. A knock at the door startled her, and she nearly dropped the letter. Her heart raced as she glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. No one should be visiting at this hour. She moved cautiously toward the door, her footsteps barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. Peering through the peephole, her breath hitched. It was Jacob. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of dread. What was he doing here, so late? Had Samuel already gotten to him? Had Jacob come to confront her, to demand answers she wasn't ready to give? She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. But the knock came again, more insistent this time, and she had no choice but to open it. Jacob stood there, his face etched with worry, his dark hair disheveled as if he had run his hands through it one too many times. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know it's late, but I needed to see you." She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. As he entered, his eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the crumpled letter still clutched in her hand. He frowned, but he didn't ask about it yet. Instead, he turned to her, his expression softening. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, running a hand through his hair again. "I kept thinking about you. Something's not right, Clara. I can feel it." Her chest tightened, and she struggled to meet his gaze. "It's nothing," she said, her voice unconvincing even to her own ears. "I'm fine." Jacob shook his head. "Don't do that," he said, stepping closer. "Don't shut me out. I know you're scared. I can see it. Just tell me what's going on." Clara hesitated, the weight of her secrets threatening to crush her. She wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the truth that had been suffocating her for years. But the fear of what he might think, of what he might do, kept her silent. "Jacob," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are things you don't understand. Things I've done, things I can't take back." He reached out, placing a hand on her arm. The warmth of his touch was grounding, but it also reminded her of how much she stood to lose. "Whatever it is," he said gently, "you don't have to face it alone. Let me help you." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the couch, the sound slicing through the tension like a knife. Both of their eyes darted to it, and Clara's stomach churned when she saw the screen light up with another unknown number. Jacob looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Who is that?" She swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "It's no one," she lied, moving to grab the phone. But Jacob was faster, snatching it up before she could reach it. "Jacob, don't," she started. But it was too late. He answered the call, his voice firm. "Who is this?" For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. And then, Samuel's voice came through, cold and mocking. "Ah, Jacob. I was wondering when we'd finally meet." Clara's blood ran cold as she watched Jacob's expression shift from confusion to anger. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Who the hell is this?" he demanded, holding the phone out toward her. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. All she could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the walls of her carefully constructed life came crashing down around her. Clara felt the air grow thick as Samuel's voice dripped through the phone like poison. Each word wrapped around her, tighter and tighter, until she could barely breathe. "So, Jacob," Samuel continued, his tone dripping with amusement. "It seems Clara's been keeping secrets from you. I wonder how much of her little charade you've been part of, huh?" Jacob's face contorted with confusion, his eyes shifting from the phone back to Clara. "Clara, what the hell is going on?" Clara could barely hold herself up, the weight of Samuel's presence, even from miles away, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to beg Samuel to stop, but all she could do was stand there, frozen. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Jacob's grip on the phone tightened, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. "Clara," he said again, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "What is he talking about? Who is this guy?" She wanted to explain, but how could she? How could she reveal the man who had haunted her for so long? How could she confess the role she had played in a twisted game that had spiraled far beyond her control? I don't know," Clara managed to whisper, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lies. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but every moment felt like a trap closing in on her. "Clara," Jacob said, his voice full of concern. "What are you hiding from me?" The accusation in his voice stung, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. She had kept secrets from him, secrets that had been buried deep within her heart, secrets that had festered for too long. She had betrayed him in more ways than one, but she wasn't ready to admit that to him. Not yet. Samuel's voice rang out again, more insistent this time. "Clara, you're really going to keep pretending, huh? You don't think Jacob deserves to know the truth? You think he'll still love you when he finds out who you really are?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over again. Would Jacob still love her? Could he ever look at her the same way after everything that had happened? The very idea made her sick. Jacob's eyes narrowed as he held the phone out to her, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his patience wearing thin. "I think you already know," Samuel's voice taunted. "I'm the one who's been pulling the strings all along. The one who made sure Clara stayed in line. And don't forget, she's been part of it, too. She's just as guilty." Clara felt her knees go weak as the weight of Samuel's words hit her like a ton of bricks. Her stomach churned, ball rising in her throat. How had it come to this? How had she become so ensnared in his web of lies, in his darkness? And now, her own guilt was being exposed in front of Jacob, the man who had no idea who she had truly become. Jacob's grip on the phone slackened slightly, but his gaze never left Clara. "Clara, what's going on?" he repeated, his voice shaking. "I need to understand. Please tell me." Clara could barely look at him. The guilt was suffocating her, and she knew she couldn't keep lying to him any longer. But the truth was too much. It was too painful, too raw, too dangerous. If she told him everything, would he ever be able to forgive her? Would he even want to? "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to manipulate you. He's trying to get inside our heads, to turn us against each other." Jacob shook his head, the confusion in his eyes deepening. "Clara, this isn't just manipulation. This is something else. This man, he knows too much. He knows things that you haven't even told me." Clara's pulse raced. Samuel was right. He did know too much. How was he doing this? How could he know every dark corner of her life? Every secret she'd tried to bury? Was he really always this close, watching, waiting for the moment to strike? But even worse than the fear was the feeling of betrayal. The knowledge that Samuel had been pulling the strings all along, that he had orchestrated everything, and that Clara had unknowingly played right into his hands. I don't know how he's doing this," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt like she was drowning, her body heavy with the weight of her secrets. "I didn't ask for this, Jacob. I never wanted any of this. But it's too late now. It's all too late. Jacob's face hardened. Then tell me. Tell me everything. The words hung in the air like a trap, and Clara felt herself shrinking under the weight of them. How could she? How could she possibly say it all? The lies, the betrayals, the destruction that had followed in Samuel's wake. How could she reveal the ugly truth without losing him forever? The phone in Jacob's hand buzzed again, the harsh sound cutting through the silence. This time, Clara didn't need to look to know it was Samuel. His presence had already consumed the room, and she could almost feel his malicious gaze on her, even from afar. Jacob, Samuel's voice came again, this time softer, more coaxing. You're wasting your time with her. She's not the person you think she is. You're better off without her. She's only going to drag you down. Don't say I didn't warn you. Jacob's expression faltered, the doubt creeping in again. Clara could see it in his eyes, the seeds of uncertainty being planted, the cracks in their relationship starting to widen. But still, he held the phone steady, his jaw clenched in frustration. I'm not letting you get away with this, he said, his voice trembling with anger. I want the truth now. But before Clara could respond, before she could even form the words to explain the darkness she had been living in, Samuel spoke one final time. You'll get the truth soon enough, he said, his tone triumphant. And when you do, don't say I didn't warn you. It's already too late. The line went dead. The silence after the call hung heavy in the air, more suffocating than anything Clara had felt in her life. Her mind raced, but it was as if her thoughts were stuck in a loop, repeating over and over. What did Samuel mean? Why had he said all those things? And why did Jacob look at her like that? Like she was a stranger. Jacob's eyes never left hers, his face etched with disbelief and something darker, something harder. It was the first time she'd seen him truly unsure, truly afraid, and it made her feel small, insignificant, like she wasn't the person she had tried so desperately to be for him. She felt herself shrink under his gaze, wishing she could just disappear. Clara, Jacob's voice trembled as he finally spoke again, but this time it was different. The softness had drained from it, replaced by something sharper. Who is he? Who is this man? Clara swallowed hard, her throat closing up. How could she explain? How could she possibly say the words that would destroy everything between them? She wanted to say nothing, to tell him it was all lies, but the truth was already bubbling to the surface. And the longer she stayed silent, the more the distance between them grew. I don't know how to explain, she whispered, her voice shaking. But Samuel, he's someone from my past. Someone I tried to escape from, but he's never really gone. He's been manipulating me for years. Jacob's face twisted in confusion. Manipulating you?
How?
What did he do to you, Clara?
What does he know about you?
Clara flinched at the harshness in his voice, but she couldn't blame him. She had kept so much from him. Too much, and now the lies were unraveling before her eyes. The shame was unbearable. He made me do things. He made me believe things that weren't true, twisted my mind, used me, she admitted, her voice cracking. But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not. I've been trying to get away from him. I swear. Jacob's gaze softened, but there was still a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wasn't fully convinced, and why would he be? How could he trust her now? Clara could feel his trust slipping through her fingers like sand, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I don't know what to believe anymore, Jacob said, his voice strained. You've been lying to me this whole time. Everything we've built, everything I thought we had, it feels like a lie. Clara's chest tightened, the weight of his words crushing her. She had ruined everything. The foundation they had built their relationship on had cracked, and now she was left with nothing but the wreckage. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted to keep these things from you. But I was so scared of losing you, Jacob. I didn't know how to tell you the truth. Jacob looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. But you kept hiding it. You kept pushing me away, pushing us away. How am I supposed to trust you now, Clara? She wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, to make him understand, but she knew it was too late. The trust they had was shattered, and it couldn't be fixed with a few words, no matter how sincere. She had allowed Samuel's influence to poison her, to dictate her choices, and now she was paying the price. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I wish I had told you sooner. I wish I had been stronger." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken pain. Clara's heart ached, but she knew that nothing she could say would fix what had been broken. The truth had already been exposed, and now there was nothing left but the wreckage of their relationship. And then, as if on cue, the phone buzzed again, shattering the silence. Clara looked at it, her stomach sinking. It was another message from Samuel, another reminder of the man who had been controlling her life for far too long. Jacob's eyes darted to the phone, his face hardening once again. "Is that him?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. Clara nodded, too afraid to speak.
She didn't want to read the message.
She didn't want to know what Samuel had to say now. But it was like a magnet pulling her in, and she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and unlocked it. The message from Samuel was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. "Clara," the message began. "You think you've escaped me? You think you can just walk away? Think again. You're mine, and you always will be. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're free. I'll be watching." The words seemed to pulse on the screen, each one a cold reminder of everything she had tried to escape. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in Samuel's grip once more. She knew he wouldn't stop. He would keep coming, keep tormenting her until she gave in again. Jacob saw the message, and the expression on his face shifted. The hurt in his eyes deepened, but there was something else there now, fear. He had been right to be afraid. Samuel wasn't just a ghost from Clara's past. He was a monster who had never let go, and now he was pulling Jacob into this nightmare as well. Clara's hand shook as she set the phone down, her eyes meeting Jacob's. She could see the question in his eyes, the same question that had been hanging between them from the start.
What now?
Could they survive this? Could they even move forward? I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this." Jacob didn't answer at first. He just stared at her, his emotions unreadable. The silence between them stretched on, a vast chasm that neither of them could cross. And Clara realized in that moment that she might never be able to fix it. She had tried so hard to make things right, but she had only made everything worse. And as Samuel's shadow loomed over them, Clara knew that she was facing not just the loss of Jacob, but the loss of everything she had once believed in. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how deeply she had failed, how deep the wound had been cut, not just by Samuel's manipulation, but by her own choices, her own silence. The weight of the past few days had accumulated like an unbearable storm, one that now raged inside of her, tearing at every ounce of her being. Jacob stood motionless, his eyes still fixed on Clara, but there was no warmth left in them. No understanding. No love. There was just a coldness, an emptiness that spread between them like a vast, insurmountable ocean. He was distant, unreachable, and Clara felt the sorrow of it deeply, a sorrow that seemed to claw at her insides, begging for release. "I never wanted this," Clara finally whispered, her voice breaking as the words escaped her lips. "I never wanted you to know all of this. I never wanted to drag you into my mess. I didn't want you to be a part of this nightmare." Jacob's lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes still studying her with a mix of anger and disbelief. His fingers twitched at his sides, as if he were holding himself back from something. He couldn't even bring himself to speak. Instead, he took a deep breath, a shaky exhale that seemed to carry all the weight of the pain he was feeling. The room seemed to close in around Clara, suffocating her, as if the walls were closing in with the enormity of what she had done. Samuel's words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain, the constant reminder of the man who had never truly let her go. It was as if every part of her had been tainted by him, Every step forward she had tried to take in life had been marred by his presence, by his control. She could feel the heat of tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't.
Not now.
Not when everything was already so broken. I didn't want this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, Jacob. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to fix this. Her voice trembled with raw emotion, the weight of her guilt crashing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. Jacob finally spoke, his voice low, each word heavy with the burden of his thoughts. You don't get it, do you? You don't get how deep this goes, Clara. I've trusted you. I've loved you. I thought we had something real, but everything has been a lie. You've been hiding so much from me. For so long. And now I can't even look at you the same way. His words stung. The truth of them stung more than anything she had ever felt. Her chest tightened painfully, and for a moment, she thought she might choke on her own breath. She could feel the space between them growing wider, more distant with each passing second. Every word Jacob spoke seemed to push her further away, a chasm forming between them that she feared might be impossible to bridge. Clara reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered in the air between them, but she didn't dare to touch him. She was terrified that if she did, she would be burned by his rejection, his anger. Instead, she let her hand fall limply to her side, as if all her strength had left her in that instant. I didn't want him to have this power over me, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to be this person. I didn't want to keep things from you. But he made me think I couldn't trust anyone. Not even you. And I thought I could protect you from him. I thought I could fix it all. Jacob's eyes flickered with something softer, perhaps, but it was quickly masked by the hardness that had settled there. You think you can fix this, Clara? You think you can fix us? You can't. You've lied to me for so long. And now I don't even know who you are anymore. The words cut her like a blade, sharper than anything Samuel had ever said to her. It felt like the last piece of the life they had built together was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. No apology, no explanation, no promise to make it right. It was too late for that. But just as Clara felt her world start to shatter, her phone buzzed again, its harsh, insistent vibration breaking through the haze of despair. She looked at the screen, her stomach dropping when she saw the name that had been haunting her all along. Samuel. Jacob's eyes snapped to the phone, his expression tightening with a mixture of anger and curiosity. What now? He hissed, his voice full of venom. What does he want now? Clara didn't want to look, didn't want to see the message. But she knew she couldn't avoid it. Not now. Not when it was the last link tying her to this twisted past she was trying so hard to escape. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone again and unlocked it, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what she was expecting, more threats? More lies? But when she saw the message, it made her blood run cold. Clara, it began, as cold and calculating as ever. You think you're free? You think you can run away from me? You're mine, and you will always be mine. There's no escaping me, sweetheart. I'll be watching, waiting. Don't forget that. The words seemed to burn into her screen, like they were etched there with a sharp knife. She could feel the weight of them bearing down on her, dragging her back into that dark, twisted world she had fought so hard to escape. It was like a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from, and now it seemed to have taken control of everything. Her relationship with Jacob, her peace of mind, her freedom. Samuel had poisoned them all. Jacob's anger flared when he saw the message. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice seething. Why is he still doing this to you? Why is he still in your life? Clara's eyes welled with tears as she stared at the screen, unable to answer him. How could she explain? How could she tell him that no matter how far she ran, no matter how much she tried to distance herself from Samuel, he would always find a way to pull her back in? And in that moment, Clara realized something that terrified her more than anything else. Samuel's control over her had never really ended. Not until she took it back herself. And that was the one thing she didn't know how to do. Clara's hands shook violently as she held the phone, her fingers unable to steady themselves. The words from Samuel, their cold, suffocating weight, kept echoing in her mind, and she could feel them worming their way into her every thought, her every breath. How had she let him back into her life like this? How had she allowed him to hold such power over her, even now, after everything? The fear that had once paralyzed her, keeping her locked in a prison of manipulation and lies, now seemed to return with a vengeance, clawing at her insides. Jacob stood in front of her, his presence so intense that it felt like the air itself had become heavy. His eyes burned with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He was seething, his chest rising and falling with every labored breath. And yet, as much as he wanted to demand answers, as much as he wanted to shake the truth from her, there was something else, something softer, something more vulnerable, that flickered in his gaze. But it was quickly buried beneath the fury, swallowed by the storm of emotions that Clara had set loose. "Clara," Jacob said, his voice low and hoarse. "You have to tell me what's going on. What is this? Why is he still controlling you like this? What the hell is happening?" Her heart ached as she looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time in the midst of the chaos that had overtaken her life. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to explain the pain she had been hiding for so long. But the truth seemed too much to bear. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, making it feel impossible to speak. I don't know how to stop him," Clara whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the admission. "I don't know how to break free. Every time I think I'm out, he pulls me back in." Jacob's face softened for a brief moment, his expression one of disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom the depth of the hell she had been living in. His gaze dropped to the phone in her hands, and then he stepped closer, his voice urgent, his tone pleading. "You have to fight this, Clara. You have to fight him. You can't let him do this to you anymore. You're not his. You're mine. Don't you see that?" Clara's breath hitched in her throat as his words, though filled with desperation, only served to deepen the divide between them.
He didn't understand.
He couldn't possibly understand the hold Samuel had on her. The years of manipulation, the threats, the control, it had been like a slow suffocation, a quiet, invisible force that had slowly choked the life out of her confidence, her independence, and now even her love for Jacob. "I want to fight him, Jacob," she said, her voice barely audible. "I really do. But every time I try, he comes after me. He comes after the people I care about. He's dangerous. And I don't know how to make him stop." Jacob was silent for a moment, his eyes still locked on her face, trying to process everything she had just revealed. The confusion in his gaze gave way to a flicker of understanding, but the anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. "So what then?" he asked, his voice raw with frustration. "We just let him win? We just let him destroy everything we've worked for?" "No," Clara whispered fiercely, finally meeting his gaze. "No, I won't let him win. But I need your help. I need you to understand. I need you to believe me. I can't fight him alone. I don't know how to fight him alone." Jacob's eyes softened, his features warping with a mix of confusion and hurt. He looked at her, his face contorted as if he were trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one standing in front of him, broken, lost, and consumed by a past she couldn't escape. "I don't know if I can do this, Clara," he admitted, his voice strained. "I don't know if I can be the one to save you from this. I don't know if I can keep going down this road, not knowing if you'll ever truly be free of him. Not knowing if I can trust you again." Clara felt the sting of his words, each one cutting deeper than she had expected. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating her, as if the space between them had grown impossibly vast. She reached for him, her hand trembling as it hovered in the air between them, but she couldn't bring herself to touch him. Her body was racked with fear, with shame, and she feared that even a touch would send him further away, further out of reach. "I don't know how to make you understand," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this. But I want to. I want to fix everything, Jacob. I want to be the person you thought I was. I want to be the person I used to be. I want to be free." Jacob's face twisted with conflicting emotions. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he turned away from her, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. Clara stood frozen, watching him, unsure of what to do or say. The uncertainty, the fear, it was all-consuming. The sound of Jacob's footsteps echoed through the room as he moved back and forth, unable to still his mind, his thoughts, his emotions. He stopped in front of her again, his eyes wild, searching her face, as if looking for some shred of hope. But he couldn't find it. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to hold on. "I don't know if I can do this, Clara," he repeated, his voice cracking, the raw pain of it settling over them both. "I don't know if I can keep loving someone who has so many secrets. Someone who's been so lost." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she realized just how much damage had been done. How much of herself she had lost. She had failed him. She had failed them both. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry." And then, as if the weight of everything had become too much to bear, Clara broke. The tears she had been holding back came pouring out, her body racked with sobs. She collapsed onto the floor, her hands clutching her chest as if she could somehow hold her broken heart together. Jacob's eyes softened, but he didn't move. He didn't know what to do with her, with the mess she had become. He didn't know if he could pick up the pieces, not when they had been shattered so violently. For a long time, they both stood in silence, Clara crying, Jacob standing frozen, lost in his own turmoil. Neither one of them knew what would happen next. Neither one of them knew how to fix what had been broken. But the distance between them was widening, and the walls were closing in. Clara's sobs echoed in the silence of the room, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had been buried too deep for too long. Her heart, once full of hope and love, now felt like a hollow pit, consumed by the guilt of her past decisions, the shame of the choices that had led her to this point. She had wanted to be strong, wanted to protect Jacob from the storm she had been carrying, but now, everything was falling apart, and she didn't know if she could put it back together. Jacob stood at a distance, his eyes fixed on her, torn between his overwhelming desire to comfort her and the raw anger that still simmered beneath the surface. He was furious with her for not telling him the truth sooner, for allowing Samuel's grip to control her, for allowing him to be a part of their lives in the first place. But as he watched her break before him, something inside him shifted. The anger didn't go away, but it became less important in that moment. He wasn't angry with her anymore. He was angry with himself for not seeing the signs, for not realizing what she had been going through. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara lifted her tear-streaked face and looked at him. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, regret, and desperation, and the pain in them was enough to break him. He felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack, piece by piece, until they crumbled at his feet. The woman in front of him was broken, but he wasn't sure if he could fix her. He wasn't sure if he could fix himself. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I know I've hurt you. I know I've lied, and I know I've pushed you away. But I need you to believe me when I say that I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." He took a step forward, his heart heavy, but still unsure of what to say, what to do. The words were stuck in his throat, tangled with his own fears, his own doubts. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Clara," he said, his voice breaking as he spoke the words that had been weighing on him for so long. "I don't know if I can trust you again. You let him control you, and I don't know if I can live with that." Her chest tightened at his words, the truth of them cutting deeper than anything Samuel had ever said to her. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she hadn't wanted any of this, that she had fought so hard to be free, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if he would ever understand. "I was weak," Clara whispered, her eyes closing as the guilt consumed her. "I let him make me weak. I let him fill my mind with lies and doubts. I let him take everything from me." She took a shaky breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the person who let him destroy me. I won't let him win, Jacob. I won't let him control me anymore." Jacob looked at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The pain in his eyes was evident, but there was something else there, too, a flicker of hope, however small. He didn't know if he could ever trust her again, but in that moment, he saw something in her that he hadn't seen in a long time: strength. He stepped closer to her, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch her arm. The contact was gentle, almost hesitant, but it spoke volumes. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she could change, that they could rebuild what had been lost. But the scars of the past were still too fresh, and the fear that this might all be another lie held him back. "Do you love me, Clara?" Jacob asked, his voice soft, almost too soft to hear. The question hung in the air between them, and Clara's heart clenched. She didn't know how to answer. She had loved him once, and she had hurt him in ways she couldn't take back. But deep down, in the very core of her being, she knew that she still loved him. She had never stopped loving him, not really. It was just buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened. "I do," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never stopped loving you. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that to you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was heavy with the tension of what was unspoken, of the fragile hope that hung in the air between them. Jacob's hand remained on her arm, the warmth of his touch grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in so long. But then, as Clara's tears subsided and her breathing became steadier, something shifted inside of her. She realized that no matter how much she wanted Jacob's forgiveness, no matter how much she longed to make things right between them, she couldn't keep living in the past. She couldn't keep clinging to the mistakes she had made. "I've spent so much time blaming myself," Clara said softly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I've spent so much time punishing myself for everything I've done wrong. But I can't keep doing that. I can't keep hurting myself because of things that can never be fixed." Jacob looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "I mean that I'm not going to let Samuel control me anymore. I'm not going to let him ruin everything I have left. I'm not going to let him take any more from me. I've spent too long living in fear of him, and I can't do that anymore." The strength in her voice surprised him. He had never heard her sound so sure of herself, so determined. And in that moment, something clicked in Jacob's mind. He realized that as much as he wanted to help her, as much as he wanted to fix everything, he couldn't. He couldn't save her from the consequences of her past. But he could be there for her now. He could support her as she fought to take back control of her life. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, Jacob," Clara said, her eyes meeting his with a sense of finality. "But I am asking you to believe in me. Believe that I can be the person I was always meant to be. And if you can't do that, I understand. But I have to move forward. I can't keep living in the shadow of the past." Jacob's expression softened, the anger and frustration melting away as he saw the truth in her eyes. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose to walk alongside her into whatever the future held. And that, in itself, was a choice. "I believe in you," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'll be here. I'll be here as you fight for yourself. As you fight for us." Clara's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sadness. She wasn't sure if everything would ever be okay again, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking the first step toward healing. And in that moment, she realized that healing didn't come from the forgiveness of others. It came from the forgiveness of herself. She could let go of the past, let go of the guilt, and move forward with her head held high. No longer a victim of her circumstances, she was free to become the person she had always wanted to be. And as they stood there together, the weight of the past still lingering in the background, Clara knew that whatever came next, she would face it with courage, with strength, and with a newfound sense of self-worth. No matter what happened, she would be okay. And that was all that mattered.